Of the current 14 highest scoring players in fantasy football, there's only one wide receiver. There's a lot of inconsistencies at the position. And even with some big games from wide receivers, it's really hard to find guys that are going to give us a consistent performance every single week, which makes this wide receiver video the most important video that you've watched so far this year. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully your fantasy team is off to a hot start. But if you're having any issues with the wide receiver position, you're not the only one finding some inconsistencies right now. 3 wide receiver sets and air it all out game plans are making it really difficult to figure out which wide receiver will be the main guy in any given week. Before we jump into all the information though, we need to announce the winner of last week's giveaway in our wide receiver video, an autographed Kyler Murray mini helmet, and congratulations to the other raccoon, who had one of the most popular comments on the entire video last week after following up my Dumb and Dumber opener. The other raccoon, make sure you send us an email, info@thefantasyheadliners.com, so we can get your shipping information and get your helmet sent out to you right away. But now it's time to break down Thursday night football. CeeDee Lamb was basically one of the top wide receivers drafted. Malik Nabers is currently the wide receiver 1. CeeDee Lamb is clearly a low risk start every single week, but things behind him are really muddied right now. CeeDee Lamb had 7 targets. That led all wide receivers and was second to Jake Ferguson. But there were 12 different Dallas players last week that had a target, which is going to make it really difficult to figure out who the wide receiver 2 will be in this offense on a consistent basis. While there could be an opportunity for somebody here, right now, the highest risk reward is going to be Brandin Cooks and his big playability. If you're looking for someone that might have a little bit of a safer floor, more than likely it's going to be Jalen Tolbert right now. Malik Nabers and Wan'Dale Robinson are both going to have some risk in a really tough matchup this week against Dallas's secondary. Right now, they're allowing the 4th fewest receptions and the 6th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers. But the big thing that could help these guys this week is potential negative game script. If Dallas can come out and play a lot better than they did last week, negative game script could lead to 8+ targets for Nabers and Wan'Dale Robinson. You're not sitting the wide receiver 1, even though there's a little bit more risk for his ceiling being lower this week. And Wan'Dale Robinson in PPR leagues is starting to make a case for being a flex option every single week. Or for those of you in half PPR leagues, if you start 3 wide receivers, Wan'Dale Robinson could end up fitting at the very end. Atlanta's defense is currently allowing the 10th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers, and that's after playing Kansas City and Philadelphia. So the New Orleans Saints wide receivers are going to be in for a little tougher matchup this week. Chris Olave owners were panicking after the first 2 weeks of the season. Rashid Shaheed with a couple of big-time touchdowns made Chris Olave owners feel like he wasn't going to be the wide receiver 1. And Rashid Shaheed let a lot of people down last week, but unfortunately, he dropped 2 potential touchdowns in that game. Chris Olave, though, is the wide receiver 1 now. After back-to-back games with at least 6 targets and 80 receiving yards, he's now caught 12 of his 14 targets on the season. He should be the guy that you look at with the safest floor of any of these wide receivers for New Orleans every single week. And then you add Rashid Shaheed in when you're looking to take a stab at those downfield plays. He's not going to have a great floor like we just saw, but his ceiling could end up being higher. New Orleans isn't allowing a ton of fantasy points or touchdowns to wide receivers right now, but they have allowed the 9th most receiving yards to wide receivers. So maybe the ceiling isn't super high for Darnell Mooney or Drake London this week, but they should still have a safe floor, especially for Drake London. Darnell Mooney may be a little bit more big play dependent. London should see the majority of the targets this week, which gives him the safest floor. Darnell Mooney, if he can break off a couple of big plays, that helps raise his ceiling, but because the majority of the targets could end up going to London and maybe Kyle Pitts, since this is an easier tight end matchup, then at that point we see Darnell Mooney lose a little bit of his floor. Chicago's pass defense is currently allowing the 9th fewest receiving yards and 6th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. This is not the type of tough matchup you want to run into without your top 2 wide receivers. Stafford spent the majority of last week spreading the ball around. No pass catcher for the Rams had more than 5 targets, but it was Tutu Atwell who did the most with his opportunities. And if you're looking for a stab out of this position group, it would have to be Tutu Atwell first and then Demarcus Robinson after that. Unfortunately, though, given the tough matchup and the fact that Stafford is throwing to everybody, it is going to be really hard to find anybody that could probably give you consistent production this weekend from the LA Rams. The LA Rams secondary is struggling right now. Currently, they allow the 4th most receiving yards to wide receivers. They're tied for 1st in most touchdowns allowed to wide receivers, and they've allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. DJ Moore and Rome Odunze, after a big week last week, could end up matching that in this matchup as well. Now, some of this does depend on Keenan Allen. If he ends up missing a week, then Odunze and DJ Moore should both be locks for double-digit targets. I do not see the Chicago Bears being able to move the ball on the ground against the Rams, and because of that, Caleb Williams is going to be throwing an awful lot. Odunze and DJ Moore both have big play upside. They both have touchdown upside, and their ceilings are probably both inside the top 12 this week. Minnesota and Green Bay has the opportunity to be one of the most interesting matchups of week 4. Sam Darnold in his breakout campaign. Jordan Love is returning this week. And for the Minnesota Vikings, we've got a couple of question marks, really around Jordan Addison, who has not practiced as of this recording since his injury. So wide receivers, we know Justin Jefferson is going to do his thing. We don't need to worry about him. Jalen Nailor is going to be another interesting flex option this week with an opportunity to find the end zone for his 3rd straight game. And Minnesota's defense has been pretty good so far, but they are giving up a ton of yards, but just not allowing teams to score. And part of that is some turnovers that are being caused. If Green Bay takes care of the football and Minnesota does not get those turnovers, Minnesota could be playing in a negative game script on the road, which would actually be good for Nailor and JJ this week. On top of that, it's also a really tough matchup on the ground because Green Bay does a great job of stopping the run. Minnesota may not have allowed a receiving touchdown to a wide receiver yet, but that doesn't mean they're not giving up plenty of yards because they've given up the 2nd most receiving yards to wide receivers. And this sets up well for Jayden Reed and Jordan Love to come back this week. And for Jayden Reed, I'm actually heading on over to Underdog and taking the over on his current line. 46.5 receiving yards feels like an automatic win this week. If you had to pick somebody out of this wide receiver rotation to have the biggest week, I feel like it's going to be Jayden Reed. Now, Romeo Doubs has still seen a decent amount of targets so far this season, and in week 1, Jordan Love was looking his way quite often. So give me Jayden Reed to have the best floor plus the best ceiling. Give me Romeo Doubs to have the best floor. And then for Dontavian Wicks and Christian Watson, they need to find 1 or 2 big plays to make their fantasy day. The Indianapolis Colts are allowing the 7th most receiving yards and the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers currently. So go ahead and fire up George Pickens for a potentially huge fantasy day. Now, a lot of people are probably going to ask about Calvin Austin as well. Pickens has 9 more targets than Calvin Austin, and even though Calvin Austin is the number 2 wide receiver on this team right now, it's because of a huge day last week. He only had 13 total receiving yards in weeks 1 and 2 before having a career day in week 3. I'm not super worried about that being consistent moving forward. Now, this week, with it being such a good matchup, he potentially does find another decent day, but George Pickens is the guy that I absolutely would bank on first. Last week, I talked about a potential mess with the wide receiver rotation once Josh Downs came back. And the prediction was it would be Adonai Mitchell that would lose time on the field and that Josh Downs would basically split with him. And that's exactly what happened. Last week, Michael Pittman and Alec Pierce played nearly identical snaps and ran nearly identical routes. Josh Downs was the wide receiver 3 playing out of the slot, and Adonai Mitchell found himself on and off the field, splitting some time with Josh Downs and going to the outside to give one of the other receivers a breather. Right now, the only wide receiver that I'm willing to bank on for the Indianapolis Colts is Alec Pierce, and that could end up changing throughout the season as Anthony Richardson starts to regain some of that accuracy and gets better over the middle of the field. It's bad right now and it's super inconsistent, and that is making things really tough for the wide receivers. But things could still end up getting better. Now, the reason Alec Pierce is the guy to take a shot on right now is because it only takes 1 or 2 plays to make his fantasy day. And the best that Anthony Richardson has been is driving the ball down the field to Alec Pierce. He's got a big play in each of the first 3 weeks. Now, he is going to bring some risk, but he may be the wide receiver 1 on this team right now. If you start him, you have to hope for that big play for him to be fantasy viable. He's not going to get more targets than the other guys and likely will not have more receptions either. If he ends up scoring a touchdown, though, he definitely would be worth the start. Now, for Michael Pittman, he probably should be going to your bench for right now. If you're okay with 4, 5, 6 fantasy points per week from your wide receiver 2, then by all means, continue to start Michael Pittman. But if you're needing to find some more upside, Pittman just isn't the guy yet. The Denver Broncos' current offensive game plan, plus the New York Jets allowing the 8th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers, is going to make it really difficult for any of these wide receivers to be fantasy viable this week. Last week, Courtland Sutton saw 11 targets. Great. Had 7 receptions. Perfect. Only had 68 receiving yards. And that is definitely a big issue when you're seeing that many targets. This game plan right now for Denver is basically throw the ball short and hopefully your wide receivers can make up some yards after the catch. I mean, when you need 10 plus targets to put you into a wide receiver 2 conversation, that's not good. And that's exactly what's happening with Courtland Sutton right now. The same goes for little Jordan Humphrey. He had 8 targets, caught 6 of them, but only for 37 yards. Really, right now with Bo Nix, they're throwing the ball an awful lot, but they're not throwing it down the field. He's only averaging like 5 or 6 yards per completion right now. He's throwing it in front of the sticks and hoping his wide receivers can make moves for him. Denver currently is allowing the 4th fewest receiving yards and the 2nd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, and Patrick Surtain would be one of those reasons why, is he's really the best guy that they have on defense and one of the few. But nonetheless, it's working right now for Denver. But in this matchup, it's going to be really interesting to see who Patrick Surtain ends up covering, because it's probably going to be Garrett Wilson, even though it shouldn't be. Now, Wilson and Lazard basically play identical snaps. They are clearly the wide receiver 1 and the wide receiver 2. But the issue is Garrett Wilson very rarely ever moves to the slot. He stays outside and wide with Adam Lazard a majority of the time. Wilson only sees about 10 to 15 snaps in the slot per week. That number should be a whole lot more. And because he's not being moved into the slot, you can't get him away from those tougher matchups. For instance, like Detroit does with Amon-Ra St. Brown. He plays outside and he plays inside, but he plays nearly double the snaps in the slot than what Garrett Wilson does. And that's allowing Detroit to exploit those tougher matchups that if you just left Amon-Ra St. Brown outside, he may have more difficult time dealing with. Garrett Wilson is really good, but so is Patrick Surtain. Wilson has a shot to have a big day, but if you're not moving him into the slot, you're really getting rid of a lot of ceiling that he could end up having. And because Allen Lazard may or may not need to deal with Patrick Surtain nearly as much as Garrett Wilson, he may have some touchdown upside once again. We are going to have to keep very close eyes on the wide receivers for Philadelphia this week. Both A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith have a very real possibility of missing. The Eagles have a bye in week 5. So if they decided to hold these guys out for week 4, they would go through the bye in week 5 with a little bit of extra rest and then hopefully come back raring and ready to go in week 6. But this is still going to be a tougher matchup. Tampa Bay has not allowed a receiving touchdown to a wide receiver yet this season. So even if either one of these guys can play, what really is their ceiling, knowing that they could be limited? Britton Covey also had a shoulder injury and did not return to last week's game. So now you're looking at Jahan Dotson and Paris Campbell as being the 2 outside wide receivers. If you're really hurting for somebody, I'd probably lean towards Jahan Dotson first, with Paris Campbell maybe having a little bit more upside. Mike Evans went off in week 1, and then in week 2, he just wasn't able to get a ton of targets because Detroit's line absolutely was burying Baker Mayfield and making it hard to find time to throw. Last week, he had Patrick Surtain in a really tough matchup. This week is where he gets back on track. Right now, Philadelphia is allowing the second most touchdowns to the wide receiver position and the third most fantasy points. This is a great opportunity for not only Chris Godwin to continue to show a lot of that safe floor that we've already seen, but for Mike Evans to hit that upside that we saw in week 1. Once again, both of these guys should be started with confidence. Both of these guys have top 12 potential as their ceilings. The 49ers are currently allowing the third most receiving yards and 7th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. It would be really nice if we could find someone from New England to take advantage of this matchup. But that's why things are complicated, because right now the New England Patriots are rotating 4 wide receivers in and out of their sets. And they're also keeping 5 to 6 wide receivers on the active roster each week. Because of that, it's making it really difficult to try and find somebody to give you consistent volume. The only person that's actually being consistent right now is Demario Douglas. Demario Douglas is coming in and playing in the slot, while the guys on the outside are being rotated in and out. So if you've got to bank on anybody this week, I would be banking on Demario Douglas. I know people are feeling real fed up with Brandon Aiyuk. After slowly being worked back in, he didn't have nearly the last week that we would have hoped, and Jauan Jennings ended up seeing that instead. But Brandon Aiyuk still had a pretty decent week last week. He saw 10 targets. He caught 5 of them, didn't really have the yards that we would have liked, but he was also tackled at the 1-yard line on a play. If he would have fallen into the end zone, that absolutely would have sealed a very good fantasy day. New England is allowing the 6th most receiving yards to wide receivers right now, so that makes Brandon Aiyuk a great play this week. But Jauan Jennings is really going to be based around George Kittle. If George Kittle is out once again, then Jauan Jennings is going to go back to a low-risk, safe floor start for me this week. But if George Kittle ends up playing, he's definitely taking some of the volume that we saw go to Jauan Jennings last week. So you're just going to want to be cautious with that and keep an eye on what ends up happening with them. Hey, maybe we can get back-to-back big weeks from Amari Cooper. The Las Vegas Raiders are ranked inside the top 10 of most fantasy points, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns allowed right now to wide receivers. Amari Cooper had a massive performance last week, and he was above and beyond the most targeted player on this team with 12. And now he gets an opportunity to push that through to this week as well. Jerry Jeudy had 7 targets last week, but he doesn't have nearly the type of upside that Amari Cooper does. And hopefully Deshaun Watson continues to push the ball outside to Coop. There are a lot of question marks about the quarterback position in Las Vegas right now. Aiden O'Connell came into the end of their Week 3 game. Then Antonio Pierce said he would not rule out making a change at the quarterback position. However, it does appear that Gardner Minshew will be the starter for Week 4. But even if they go with Gardner Minshew, what happens mid-game if Minshew isn't playing that well and they go back to Aiden O'Connell? That's a whole lot of risk for Davante Adams and for Jakobi Meyers. And just for the record, Davante Adams being upset on the sideline, I'm absolutely okay with. This dude signed on to Las Vegas to play with his buddy Derek Carr. And then Las Vegas shipped Derek Carr out and pushed him out of the building the very first year together. I absolutely would be upset with the quarterback positional change that he has seen while playing there so far. Davante Adams is going to be a medium risk this week because he's got the target potential and should lead the team. Jakobi Meyers is a medium risk because he does have some touchdown potential. This isn't the worst matchup in the world, but it's the quarterbacks that I'm way more concerned with. The LA Chargers are currently allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Rashee Rice, because of the sheer amount of volume he's getting right now, absolutely is still a locked-in starter for us and has a really nice floor every single week. But for those of you victory lapping Xavier Worthy after Week 1, it reminds me a lot about Clyde Edwards-Helaire a few years back, who had a huge start to the season and then basically disappeared the rest of the way. Unfortunately for Xavier Worthy, this past week, he actually started losing snaps to Juju Smith-Schuster. To start the season, Xavier Worthy was actually seeing a decent amount of snaps in 12 personnel when an offense brings 2 tight ends out onto the field. But this past week, he wasn't being utilized in 12 personnel, and Juju was the wide receiver that was being brought in instead. Now that Juju also scored a touchdown last week, we're going to need to keep a really close eye on how that rotation starts to work out because Xavier Worthy is quickly losing fantasy relevance if if Juju Smith-Schuster is coming in and taking a large majority of his potential snaps. Kansas City is currently allowing the 7th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers. So Ladd McConkey, for me, is definitely the safest bet this week. Quentin Johnston has a couple of touchdowns in back-to-back games, but last week it was really a blown play that made his day and that touchdown. So I'm not ready to bank on him being a consistent option as of yet. Also, a lot of questions out right now on Justin Herbert. He ended up needing to leave the field after re-aggravating his leg injury, and there's no clear consensus on whether or not he's going to be able to go this week. Ladd McConkey is like a safe wide receiver 3 option due to the amount of targets he could end up having. But in this matchup, he may not have much upside at all. Ja'Marr Chase is coming off a 2-touchdown performance. Carolina is currently tied for allowing the 2nd most touchdowns to wide receivers. Let's lock our boy Ja'Marr Chase in for another big week. He's definitely going to be a low-risk start. He's the guy in this offense. We saw it last week. It's going to continue to be the same thing. And it's good to see that Joe Burrow's wrist appears to be fully healthy, which was the biggest concern coming into the season. Now, T. Higgins and Andrei Iosivas are both going to be medium risks for me, but there's going to be some interesting things to see how it plays out in this matchup. T. Higgins saw 6 targets in his return last week. Had a pedestrian night, but he was really close to having a big night with a touchdown grab. But he stayed healthy. That's what matters. But Andrei Iosivas may be killing that a little bit right now for T. Higgins in his fantasy upside because Iosivas was able to find the end zone once again. And if he's being utilized in the red zone out of the slot, kind of similar to what Tyler Boyd was, he's going to have some good games here or there, but he's not going to be super consistent. So in this matchup, where it's actually a good matchup, it's going to be interesting to see how Higgins and Iosivas move forward with their target potential. One thing, though, that could end up hurting them if Carolina doesn't put up points like they did last week and Cincinnati's defense plays a lot better than they did against Washington, it could be some positive game script and a lot more running for Cincinnati. Cincinnati a couple of weeks ago held Patrick Mahomes to his 2nd worst performance ever as a starter. And then they turned around and got cooked by Jaden Daniels on Monday Night Football. Which Cincinnati defense shows up this week is going to be really important to the outcome of this game. But give me the red rifle, Andy Dalton, to at least make Deontay Johnson fantasy viable after a big performance last week. 14 targets, 8 receptions, 122 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Maybe we don't get that from DJ every single week, but this guy should be locked in as a top 24 potential wide receiver as of right now with top 12 potential upside, just because Carolina could be playing neutral or negative game script the majority of the season. And with Adam Thielen headed to the IR with a hamstring issue, Xavier Legette definitely has a little bit more potential to showcase some of that big playability and become the number 2 target on this team. Houston's defense is currently ranked inside the top 10 of most touchdowns, receiving yards, and fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. And people are going to see Christian Kirk's numbers last week and automatically be like, yep, I'm all in. We're back on the Christian Kirk train. Now, one thing we're going to monitor through the rest of the week is Gabe Davis. He left their game early with a shoulder injury, but in reality, Doug Peterson made it sound like it was really because of the blowout. There was no reason to put him back out there and that he should be fine for their upcoming game. But here's the issue with Christian Kirk. He actually played less this week than what he played in weeks 1 and 2. And it's not because it was a blowout. It was through the entirety of the game that he was utilized on the field less than what he was the last couple of weeks. Devin Duvernay and Parker Washington were seeing themselves mixed into the fold a little bit more often in this game. And if we start seeing the type of rotation that takes Christian Kirk off the field even more, that is awful for him, even in these solid matchups. Christian Kirk really just took better advantage of his opportunities this week than what he has as of recent. We're going to see some pop-up games for him. He is a talented wide receiver, and if Trevor Lawrence looks his way, it's going to be exactly what he needs to get back onto a fantasy viable performance streak. However, a lot of it's going to depend on Gabe Davis. If Gabe Davis is fine and plays this week, then Christian Kirk may still be in trouble seeing himself come off the field a lot more than we would like. But like I've told everybody asking about Christian Kirk, you're only going to drop him if you're okay dealing with the fact that he becomes a top 24 option if even Brian Thomas or Gabe Davis miss time. Brian Thomas, to me, continues to be the number one wide receiver on this team, though, given his big playability and his target share. Jacksonville is currently allowing the 5th most receiving yards to the wide receiver position. So you're probably asking the question, why are Stefon Diggs and Tank Dell maybe not given a better risk rating? Well, we know Nico Collins is the number one. That guy's not disappearing, and we have now seen that for 3 straight weeks, and of course last season as well. So he's going to stay low risk in a very good matchup. But the reason Diggs and Dell are going to be medium and high is because these two could flip-flop this week. Stefon Diggs has definitely been that number 2 so far, and Tank Dell has kind of been left in the dust. Last week in his first trip back to Minnesota, Stefon Diggs definitely got the ball a little bit more often, and I'm not shocked about that. But now it's time to get Tank Dell going, and I am sure CJ Stroud wants that to happen. So right now, these guys, neither of them are going to be a low risk for me because I really don't know who's going to get the work this week. Tank Dell has a little bit more upside than Stefon Diggs for me. Diggs has a little bit of a safer floor, but Dell could absolutely go off if they make it a point to make him the focal point of the offensive game plan this week. We saw a lot of growth from Jayden Daniels this week, and that growth and ability to throw the deep ball, which we know he could do coming out of college, absolutely led to Terry McLaurin having his breakout performance of the 2024 season. Now, Terry McLaurin is not going to be safe moving forward by any means. This is an okay matchup for Washington going up against Arizona. But for Terry McLaurin, he's a little too dependent on the big plays right now. We saw that this past week. Great week, great performance, but really his performance was based on 2 huge passes. If they're not finding those huge passes every single week, we definitely could see a volatile floor to ceiling range for Terry McLaurin. And because of that, he's still going to carry a medium risk for right now, even though he's really the only guy that I'm looking to play from the Washington offense at the wide receiver position. I mean, Washington is allowing the most touchdowns, the most fantasy points, and the 3rd most receiving yards to wide receivers right now. Whoever plays Washington, you start your wide receivers against them. Their secondary is trash, and there's no easy way to say that. This week, Marvin Harrison Jr. clearly is the number 1 option. If you've got Marv, congratulations. He may be a top 5, even top 3 wide receiver this week. If you're looking for a flex option, then let's roll with maybe Greg Dortch or Michael Wilson. And some of that is going to depend on Trey McBride. If Trey McBride is cleared to play from the concussion protocol, then Michael Wilson is probably the only guy I'm taking a look at to flex. If Trey McBride isn't cleared from the concussion protocol, then give me Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch to both have pretty solid days. You think it's been fun watching Buffalo the last couple of weeks? Get ready to watch them against this Baltimore secondary, who's currently ranked inside the top 5 for most receiving yards, most touchdowns, and most fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. And because of that, it's really simple for me this week. Khalil Shakir is going to be my Manscaped must-start wide receiver to watch this week. I am super pumped for Khalil Shakir to have another big game against a secondary that hasn't been able to stop anybody. And just because beach season is over with, it doesn't mean that you should stop taking care of yourself with Manscaped's great lineup of tools. In fact, with Christmas coming up, you should be heading on over to manscaped.com and using code word headliners20 for 20% off your entire order and free shipping to get some gifts for somebody that you know needs it. And right now over on Underdog, Khalil Shakir's receiving line is only set at 46.5 receiving yards. Let me just lock that in easy because with this matchup and Khalil Shakir being the number 1 wide receiver on this team right now, he should easily find a way to go over that. Now, I think people are going to bring up Keon Coleman, but keep in mind that really his only target was a touchdown reception. And after playing a majority of the snaps in week 1 and week 2, in week 3, Keon Coleman didn't see the field at all during the first 2 drives for the Buffalo Bills. That is super concerning and something to keep an eye on with him. Buffalo is currently allowing the 3rd fewest receiving yards and 4th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. They're playing great ball right now. But Zay Flowers' down performance last week is not something that I'm super concerned with. Last week after the first quarter, Baltimore was already up 14-3. Then after the second quarter, they were up 21-6. And after the third quarter, they were up 28-6. With that big of a lead the entire game, Baltimore basically had abandoned passing the ball and was just running it. Now, Dallas came back at the very end of the game. Baltimore took their foot off the pedal a little bit, and they may learn from that this week, but Zay Flowers should be back to seeing double-digit targets if Baltimore isn't stopping the pass game so early in the game. Miami is currently allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, but the good news for Tennessee is that DeAndre Hopkins appears to be healthy, which is a much needed boost for Will Levis and this offense. Now, maybe it kills Calvin Ridley, but DeAndre Hopkins should start seeing quite a bit of targets moving forward. And while he might not have a huge ceiling in a game like this, he should still have a pretty decent floor. There's a good chance Tennessee stays in a neutral game script here. Will Levis hasn't really been all that good, and we don't even know who the quarterback is going to be for the Miami Dolphins as of yet. So really, probably no blowout on either side of the ball. Everyone's going to be throwing it throughout the game, and DeAndre Hopkins could still find himself with enough targets to sneak inside the top 24. I really didn't think it was going to come to this in 2024, but here we are. Not only is Jalen Waddle a serious candidate to be left on your bench this week, but Tyreek Hill may be as well. But that's going to be left up to all of you. The only thing I can tell you is that you need to make a decision on what you can and can't deal with. If you can't deal with the fact that Tyreek Hill on your bench going off for a bunch of points wouldn't absolutely kill you, then you've got to put him in your lineup. If you're okay taking that risk, this may be the matchup to do it. We don't even know who the quarterback is going to be as of yet. And not only that, but Tennessee is allowing the 5th fewest receiving yards, the 4th fewest fantasy points, and has not given up a touchdown to a wide receiver as of yet. The playmaking ability of Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill give them a crazy range of outcomes in a matchup that is so tough like this with a backup quarterback that we're not even sure who it is as of yet. All it takes is one play for either of these guys to make themselves a wide receiver 1 for the week. But if they don't make enough plays and this game is super inconsistent, these guys may not even be good enough to be a wide receiver 2. Seattle and Detroit on Monday Night Football should be a whole lot of fun to watch, and the Seattle wide receivers are set up to be extremely successful this week. DK Metcalf is a smash start for me, going up against the Detroit secondary that allows the most receiving yards and 5th most fantasy points currently to the position. Now, Tyler Lockett comes in right after that. I think he has the 2nd safest floor. Tyler Lockett seems to perform well against the Lions. And right now, over on Underdog, I'm going to go higher than his current line that's set. 44.5 receiving yards is the lowest line for any of the Seattle wide receivers currently over on Underdog. And I think they're going to have a solid day. So give me Tyler Lockett to have one of the better days. Right now, Detroit is beat up, and it is not looking great for them. Brian Branch is in the concussion protocol. They just lost Marcus Davenport. And then also on the inside, Onwuzurike is definitely going to be a big miss if he can't end up going this week. JSN is a little bit more risky for me. I definitely could see him having a really, really good day, but I do think the targets could end up going to DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett before they end up funneling over to JSN. But really, all 3 of these guys are startable for me. And not only is Detroit beat up on the defensive side of the ball, but their all-pro center and one of the best centers in football, Frank Ragnow, has a half-torn pectoral. He said he's going to try and play through it, but even if he does, how good is he going to be? Seattle's secondary is currently allowing the 3rd fewest receiving yards and fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. And Devin Witherspoon is probably going to be matched up on Jameson Williams this week. We could end up seeing another down performance for him. Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be a medium risk start. He's definitely going to see the volume needed, but it's going to depend on the game script and whether or not Detroit can move the ball on the ground. There's a lot of what ifs in this game, and for the Detroit Lions, this is not what they needed so earlier in the year. Now, the good news is they have a bye in week 5, so we'll see how that ends up playing out with their game plan this week. But Detroit, unfortunately, losing at home to Seattle is a very real possibility. Yo, Headliner Nation, another week of start and sit wide receiver analysis in the books, and hopefully these videos have been doing wonders for your fantasy teams. It is a tough landscape to try and navigate right now, and hopefully with our videos you're finding things a little bit easier. So make sure you let us know in the comments if you have any questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But for now, Headliner Nation, I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.